Like a lot of people, Abra and I visited Japan for the first time earlier this year. It was an amazing trip, and I highly recommend going. We explored cities and countryside by train and bicycle. We met people from around the world in bars that had a maximum capacity of less than a dozen. We lost ourselves in food markets, and we got to spend a day at the World Expo in Osaka. As any good vacation should, it provided us with discovery and surprise. For me, one of the big surprises was Hiroshima. I don't know that I was aware of any expectations I had about visiting the city, but the historic context certainly informed my preconceptions. There are few places where the name of a city has become more synonymous with a single event. Often with hindsight, what we find surprising is actually not really surprising at all. What I was most struck by was the 20-something baristas laughing at something on their phones, the businessman running for the bus, the young brothers chasing each other around their mom's leg while she was struggling to get them to cross the street. In short, I was taken by how normal this place was. Again, in hindsight, none of this is surprising. It's been 80 years since the first nuclear bomb in history was dropped over the city. 80 years is a long time for a city to recover. Maybe why I had the response I did is that a city doesn't really fully recover from any trauma, but people and cities are extraordinarily resilient. Just hours after the blast that killed 80,000 residents instantly and more than 140,000 by the end of that year, the survivors started to rebuild their city. Lights started coming back on the very next day and were restored to all of the homes that escaped fire damage by the end of November. In less than a week, water pumps, makeshift hospitals, banks, streetcars, train service all began operating as best as they could. Despite numerous members of the staff losing their lives in the attack, the radio station resumed broadcasting the very next day. Ultimately, recovery took years, decades. Today, the only visible traces of that trauma in the built environment are intentional. Nothing about what remains is accidental. Its preservation is memorial, deliberate and exacting. The centerpiece is the Jimbako Domu, the atomic bomb dome, a lone structure at the epicenter left just as it was found. Its power isn't simply that it survived, but that its survival exposes everything around it that didn't. In the immediate aftermath, it was the one building left standing. Now, it's the only building left unrebuilt. That inversion turns the dome into an architectural scar, an intentional reminder of what happened. If the dome itself is a scar, what surrounds it is even more layered, more complex. That complexity starts with the name of the park that the dome sits in, Peace Memorial Park. It's hard to overstate how bold the decision was to name a park born from one of the most devastating single acts of war in human history after peace. It's a declaration, not of closure, but of intention, that this place would not be defined only by what it was destroyed, but what the world still hopes to build. The park is home to colorful paper cranes by the hundreds of thousands, both at the Children's Monument and now climbing the glass chamber of the neighboring Orozuru Tower. There are several other monuments and a museum scattered throughout the park. Most of the day, the sound of the peace bell vibrates in the park as tourists and locals line up to swing a mallet against the bell. Watching people interact with the bell is a window into what this park has become. Some people, generally older, approach it with a somber respect, the reverence of this place and its history heavy in their act. But that tone seems to be the exception now. Some people appear to be creating their own ceremony in the sonic act, perhaps newlyweds ringing the bell together, inventing their own tradition of celebrating their love. Mostly now the bell is being run for one reason, for the joy of ringing the bell. And it is, the sound, the act, the impact, it's tremendously joyful. I realized visiting this place that this joy is an important part of why this historically significant city felt so normal to me. The joy doesn't try to replace the trauma, but it lives alongside it. Not a loud, boisterous joy, but a quiet, communal joy. The act of sharing space in memory and in hope. It's the annual Lantern Festival at the river. It's the children laughing in a memorial park. It's lining up to swing a mallet against a bell, a peace bell. That idea that joy in public space is not frivolous but foundational is at the heart of Jay Pitter's work. She shows us that thriving communities aren't built on infrastructure and policy alone, but on the emotional life of a place. How we care for one another, how we honor public memory, how we create conditions where everyone can belong. She calls this public joy and asserts that it's essential urban infrastructure and a human right. Not individual happiness, but a shared civic practice, a way of designing, planning, and storytelling that helps us meet our challenges, not avoid them. Jay's work invites us to steward our own joy and each other's, cultivating cities where grief and imagination, struggle and celebration, memory and possibility all have room to exist together. She joins me today to talk about how public joy is created, why it matters, and how it can transform our places and our communities. Jay Pitter joins me after the break. Jay, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking time to be here on the Sidewalk Ballet, and I'm excited to get into your work and some of the new projects you're working on, which are aplenty. And I'm hoping you can start us with a little background of how you got into this world of placemaking and equity and design and community. And maybe part of that, as we get there, what is the world that you consider you work in?
It's such a pleasure to be here, Chip. Thank you so much for having me. So, how did I get here? I actually started off as a cultural funder and policymaker. I was at the time one of the youngest in the province where I was working, which is Ontario, and the country. I live in Canada. And so basically, I funded cultural arts activities in schools and communities, taking place in large cities like the one where I live, Toronto, also in rural communities, a lot of Franco-Ontarian communities, and then also Indigenous fly-in communities. And at the time, one of the things that I recognized was the fact that for culture, art, community to flourish, you really needed to have great infrastructure. And not everybody had access to really great infrastructure. So, for example, living in Toronto, we have so many incredible museums, alternative art spaces, galleries, pop-ups. And then when I went traveling to, let's say, Sault Ste. Marie, I was having meetings in like ice fishing huts, which was pretty fun, especially for a girl who grew up in public housing in a major urban center, right? It was very different, but it just gave me an opportunity to sort of see those infrastructure challenges and differences. And so that made me interested in the built environment. And a lot of people know my early story of, again, growing up in a low income, socially challenged, poorly designed public housing community. So even before that, at a very early age, I began to see the difference in terms of like having great infrastructure, great sidewalks, access to active transportation, beautiful amenities, libraries, community centers, and not having access to those things, right? So that also really informed my interest in infrastructure. So I ended up leaving the Arts Council to working in a major hospital system. And during that time, I started doing a lot of work in capital development. So I started really understanding infrastructure from the vantage point of fundraising and development of infrastructure. And so that was also a lesson and an education. And a fun fact that a lot of people don't know about me is that I was a single mom, still am, of a brilliant, well, people know this now because I brag about her a lot online, but of a Juno Award-winning, brilliant electronic DJ and producer who tours the world. And so that's pretty neat. But at that time, before she moved into the arts in that way, as she entered university in an undergraduate program, and I decided to go back to university same year, same university at a graduate level. And so I was actually for a time in university at the same time as my child.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that could be both amazing and not for your child, but that's so cool.
That's so interesting that you say that. It was amazing for me. I loved seeing her on
I'm
campus,
sure.
and she would always say to her friends, "That's my mom." And then I would hear her say, "No, I'm serious. That's
That's
my
amazing.
mom."
I love that.
Um, I'm sure it was cringy for her sometimes though, right? Like
Yeah,
bumping into your mom.
I'm sure the positive outweighed that, though.
Yeah, so I went back to grad school, and I did have the opportunity to go down the pure planning stream, but I really didn't want to. I've always been multidisciplinary in my approach. So I had those two major jobs that I talked to you about, but prior to that, I had written quite a bit. I did political commentary and shared stories about cities and public spaces for our national broadcaster, CBC Radio. And so you asked me what domain I exist in. I very proudly exist in no singular domain. I feel very strongly that public spaces and city building more broadly requires a very nuanced and complex multidisciplinary lens. So I was never interested in just being a planner or just being an architect or one single discipline. I was really interested in having a good perspective from a learning standpoint of a number of disciplines. And that's not to suggest that I don't have respect for people who are in a singular discipline. Just for myself, I came at it from a multidisciplinary lens. And so in grad school, I studied some planning. I got to study some gender responsive design. In fact, my thesis was focused on gender responsive design and women's safety. So that is actually the door that I come through when I started talking about equitable planning and placemaking, because I was hyper focused on gender responsive cities and public spaces. And so that's kind of how I got here. It's been sort of circuitous, very creative, and risky. I remember when I first graduated, for a brief period of time, I contemplated going back to get a second master's in planning because I have a master's in environmental studies. And I thought about going back for a second master's, and a good friend of mine, actually, Eric Mann, he is an urban planner and he's an architect as well. He actually discouraged me from doing so. He said, absolutely not. Do not get a second degree. You know so much about planning. I'm so glad that I listened to him. Today, I am an adjunct professor of urban planning. I work on large-scale urban planning projects, and I'm an author. So I get to be these three incredible things that allow me to explore public spaces and the notion of place and our relationship to place in a way that I think is far more flexible and generative and also rigorous than if I had gone down a single pathway.
This is a relatively new podcast conversation and broadly themed around city building and people who build cities and how cities work for people. And it is so multidisciplinary. I want to dig in a little more to the infrastructure, how we are as in community and infrastructure, and what did you learn early in these explorations around that?
Yeah, so Chip, before I answer your question, let me also say that one of the reasons that I agreed to do this podcast is because of your nuanced and inclusive approach to how you've framed this conversation around place. I really commend you for doing that. And I'll just say that I was very privileged very early on in my practice in terms of getting a front row seat of how infrastructure tangibly impacts people's experiences of place on a day-to-day basis. Some of my very first projects were in the American South, working on projects pertaining to Confederate monument sites and getting to learn about the fact that many Confederate monument sites were not actually erected sort of during the time of the Civil War, but they were erected later on when African American communities started to, despite the auction block and all of those violent and restrictive policies, started to gain a real social and economic foothold, building community and building wealth. Those monuments were erected as a public message to say, you need to stay in your place. They were meant to be symbols of terror and restriction. They're not strictly remnants of a particular historical time when we didn't know better. I learned about the fact that highways, when I work in places like Detroit and other cities that are extremely car centric, that highways were strategically used to displace wealthy African American, Jewish, and other racialized communities. That highways were actually erected to perpetuate segregation. So we often talk about redlining and housing when we think about that, but actually street-based infrastructure is used to do the exact same thing. When we look at communities in more affluent neighborhoods, there's a reason that there are no sidewalks there. There are no sidewalks there because it's done to keep people from actually traversing those communities. It's a way of making ungated communities actually gated, because if there's no sidewalk, then people cannot pass through, right? So people only drive in to those communities for individuals who live there. Of course, we have to talk about ability and disability. There was a time when anyone who had any type of disability was not expected to be seen and out and about in the city. And so that's why we have cities that have a lack of accessible infrastructure. It's not by accident. I'll put on my gender-based hat for a moment as well. Public transit doesn't work for women because the time that public transit was built was during a time when women were in the home, and the home is considered to be a domestic space. And so women were intended to be at home when public transit was being built for men specifically. The city has been conceived as a masculine space for men to ascertain economic wealth and to explore and experience adventure. All of these things are things that if you go to a good university and take courses outside of the disciplines, you can learn these things. And things are changing now. The canon in planning and architecture is catching up very slowly. And so you can learn that within those programs. But I really had the opportunity, not only from learning it through multidisciplinary graduate studies, but I've seen it firsthand on the ground. And so when I started very significant conversation around public space, infrastructure, equity, and freedom and joy a decade ago, it wasn't really based on what I'd read in a textbook. It was based on being on the ground with communities, doing the research, and experiencing it in a really embodied way.
Right. I think that's, when we look at most of what we've learned in this space, it is just from that. It's from observation and on the ground. You mentioned that the canon is catching up. I feel like there is this moment of like, we're all catching up with Jay Pitter, and then there she goes. So now you have kind of introduced this idea of public joy as infrastructure. And I want to learn more about that. You've been working at this intersection of place, design, equity, and justice in public space. And now, what has led you to public joy as a new central principle, and how do you explain that as infrastructure?
Amazing. Thank you so much for this question. So, a part of it is personal and a part of it is professional. And then there is that area that is gray where it is absolutely both, because anybody who does this work from a place of passion and ethics, the personal and the professional kind of merge together. So what I will say is that when you think about public spaces and you talk about things like spatial equity, the conversation can be a few things that I think are not particularly productive. A, very theoretical and identity based. The conversation sometimes doesn't land with actual bodies that belong to people who hold complex identities together in a shared place with shared desires. So that's number one. Number two, it tends to be very deficit based. So on one side, you have people who are having things done to them, and sometimes that narrative really takes away from those people's agency. It can really flatten those people as being strictly oppressed, strictly marginalized, strictly people who are seeking equity or seeking justice. It flattens the cooperation, the creativity, the resilience of those people. And then on the other side, you have people who are doing the thing, right? And I think that those types of conversations don't necessarily lend themselves to creating bridges where people begin to see each other beyond, like we say that race and gender are manufactured constructs. And at the same time, in conversations that are rooted in equity or spatial equity specifically, we hold up those constructs first and foremost, like we deify those constructs. We don't leave room for the fact that people are complex and deserve to be approached as such. So I noticed that I was in a lot of flattened conversations. And I'm not really good with flattened conversations. I have lived across class. So I grew up poor, became a professional as a single mother. And so I've been poor, and as an adult, I've been very solidly middle class. Also, the public housing community where I grew up, there were poor Black kids and there were also poor white kids and poor Asian and South Asian kids. And so I'm not saying that class and race aren't interrelated, but sometimes we talk about race without talking about class and place together. And I think that when you do that, you also flatten conversations. So I just felt that the conversations were becoming a bit too polarized, a little bit too archetypal, and kind of boring, to be honest. The same conversations were happening over and over again. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have conversations about spatial justice until we achieve spatial justice. But I started thinking, is being included enough? Is equity enough? Like, I don't know if people who are absolutely the most marginalized wake up and think, I want to have an equitable day today. I think that people who are the most marginalized want better than that. And the better is public joy. It goes beyond including people. It goes even beyond equity. What is the embodied feeling? What is the outcome that is beyond an emotion, but truly an outcome that we can observe, that people feel, that can be seen in interpersonal relations, that is embedded in the policy, that is enabled through design? And so I just wanted to do the harder thing.
So you talk about that as an outcome, but from what I've understood and what you're reading is you're really looking at it not just as an outcome, but as a core principle. Or framework. You've created a framework for public joy. So how are you defining public joy? How is it distinguished from individual joy or self-care? Like, what is public joy in this conversation?
I love that you've asked that because it definitely isn't like, hey, let's go to the spa. It's not that.
Right.
And it's also not a fleeting feeling or happiness. I've done deep research on happiness and joy. And certainly these two things are not mutually exclusive. But what I have found in the research is that happiness almost is always situational and dependent on external circumstances, where joy is deeply cultivated and it can exist alongside a certain degree of complexity like grief and trauma. And so when I was digging into that research, I started applying it to public spaces because we know that public spaces have so many layers of history. There's always, at all times, there are all these forces working that are linked to trauma, linked to grief, linked to policies where people were profoundly harmed and excluded. And so in that context, happiness can't really flourish, but joy can. And so as I started digging into that research, I, came up with this high level definition, which is that public joy is not an emotion or an idea. It is a generative civic condition. It is a condition that asks what kinds of systems, spaces, policies, and social attitudes would make our collective joy, belonging, and thriving not possible, but inevitable. Let's start there. That is indeed the definition. I'm looking for the inevitability of public joy. And it is important that it is collective because certainly and surely people do have individual experiences of personal joy. And that's a part of the problem. That's why we're having all of these spatial equity and conversations about injustices in public spaces because some people are experiencing quite a bit of individual joy. And so when you put public joy or collective joy together as a concept, that means that we're not moving forward until everybody is included and experiencing this audacious goal. So that's what the fundamental difference between public joy and individual joy is. And a lot of the happiness indexes, because I've researched those as well, tend to focus on the individual.
Hmm. And situational.
Yes, very much so. It's individual and it's situational. And happiness indexes do not interrogate economic systems, environmental forces, and histories of harm that resonate and that would impact someone's sort of sense of happiness as well.
So, Jay, whenever I read your work, I find myself having to stop and go back and reread something because you just say these really powerful, impactful things and keep going. So I want to stop and go back because you said generative civic condition. And I think that's important. I want to unpack that just a little bit. What do you mean generative?
So I'm also a student of Lefebvre, right? So Henri Lefebvre talks about the fact that public spaces at all times is reproducing itself based on who is in the public space, our identities, our attitudes, our interactions at any given time, plus invisible forces, environmental and policies. So we are generating the character of public spaces in real time. Public spaces are living. A public space that was safe and joyful a day ago could feel very different today and could feel different depending on who is in the public space or what types of policies are being enacted in any given moment. So when I talk about public space being generative civic infrastructure, it is underscoring the fact that public spaces are not static. And when I talk about generative as well, I'm talking about co-creation, the fact that we're always co-creating public spaces. I'm talking about creativity and possibility.
A lot of your work that I've seen, a lot of the projects you work on, are in places that have generated a lot of trauma, and deep trauma in a lot of the places you've worked. And you've said before that we can't design our way to equity without emotional and cultural repair. So how does joy fit into the repair process there? And I don't know, there's any number of examples I could pull out of projects you've worked on. You mentioned, the slave trading block, and I know you did some amazing work in reimagining Cheapside. How does joy relate to a place like that?
I think that another thing that I've had the great privilege of learning while undertaking these types of projects is being very careful not to re-victimize communities who have experienced harm. So whether I am working with sex workers out east who have faced tremendous violence in park systems, or as you say, folks in Lexington, descendant of people who experienced the transatlantic slave trade, or working in Little Jamaica, a community that's been erased due to a very negligent public transit project. I could list all the things. There's so many projects that I've been called into, like a project related to an indigenous burial ground that, the city actually dug up bodies and used them as cadavers at the local university and then wanted to build condos on top of. Like the levels of harm are astounding. And so, whenever I am working on these types of projects, one of the things that I started doing very early on in my practice was informally mapping stories and sites of joy, even within all of those histories of harm and all of the trauma. So, sex workers who are street involved, they have community, they have systems, they have ways of taking care of each other. They have great intellect around wayfinding, keeping each other safe. Uh, when I think about, and I write about this in my upcoming book, Black Public Joy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when I was doing research on that book, one of the things that I found was that the very earliest enslaved person still had traditions of joy and pageantry and beautification and love, even during the most dire, frightening times. And so I think I needed to look for those things and create space for those stories and those cultural practices for my own self navigating that work, but also as due diligence and accountability to those communities so that I wasn't re-victimizing those communities. And so when I created space for those conversations, you'd be so surprised at how many practices of joy were evoked. People talked about grandmothers and great grandmothers who told them stories of resistance through joy. And not just resistance, but just these everyday kind of rituals of joy. And so I became very fascinated by that. And I started to observe that in the work, when I created space for that, it created more space in the process, more air in the room, more of a sense of agency and possibility. And when I'm working on those projects, that is indeed a part of the job, not just taking people down this terrible path of reliving harm.
So I want to kind of shift to to the practical application of your public joy framework and understand that a little more. And I know you did the summer series with unhoused youth, maybe sharing around that. And particularly, I'm curious about what is the principles of the framework you have developed for public joy, and metrics. How do you measure that? Kind of looking at a tactical, how do you implement work around public joy in a place, in a project, in a community?
It's one of my greatest, no puns intended, joy to explore how to make this thing real and tangible. And so perhaps I'll take the question in two parts. I'll tell you a little bit about the framework that is under development right now, and then I'll talk about the project that I did this past summer, which just brought such great satisfaction to me personally. So, again, as a multidisciplinary practitioner and as someone who works at the intersection of academia, all of this started with research for sure, right? So, research informed by my practice. And so, I am in the process of developing principles that are tethered to this public joy framework. And so, for example, two principles are embodied presence and reciprocity. Let's just look at those for a second. So I look at embodied presence and reciprocity, and then I go to the research to see what is research saying about embodied presence and reciprocity as it pertains to public space. So that's where my practice experience comes in to bridge the sort of multidisciplinary research. And so, for example, research shows that as much as 70% of communication is nonverbal, expressed through gesture, posture, and like things like proximity. Reciprocity is also expressed through sort of like small acts of courtesy. So when I think about that within the context of a public space, I now start to think about metrics. So what would those metrics be that are linked to the principle and the research? Well, the metrics would look like pausing, yielding, assisting, greeting. That's what it looks like in public space. Another thing that it really looks like, which becomes its own principle, is stewardship. So there is a lot of research on stewardship and how that lends itself to everything from public health to maintenance of spaces to safety. And so that is why I talk about the importance of us being co-stewards of public joy. And so when I think about a tactic around the principle of stewardship and co-stewardship, what I'm looking at is what are the design approaches and policies that enable people the freedom to co-steward a public space, like physically co-steward a public space. And then there's also the kind of co-stewardship that is social.
When you talk about stewardship, I'm thinking stewardship of each other and of each other's public joy, but also of the space which sort of supports that and the culture. And so the stewardship is kind of, it feels broad to me. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's a very fundamental principle, and it is extremely broad. It begins with everyone taking responsibility for cultivating their own public joy. So, how am I cultivating or a good steward of my own public joy, right? And that has everything to do with, how I move through my city, experiences of beauty, my responsibility to connect with community, to contribute to community. It may be through mentorship. It may be through knowing my neighbor down the street, right? So, like, how do I first identify what my own individual sort of public joy looks like in action? So that it starts there. I'm responsible for cultivating my own public joy. And then I'm also responsible for making sure I'm not stepping on the public joy of others. because I'm a cranky little bitch. Do you know what I mean? Like that. So I'm not the person who's saying to the young people, your music is too loud, or saying to someone who's racialized, like, do you really belong in this park? Right? Like, how do I make sure that I am not actually impinging on someone else's public joy by policing their free expression of joy in public? And of course, free expression that is not doing harm. Obviously, that's a caveat, right? And so that's one way that I can support and steward someone else's public joy. But another way is I can be very active. So there's not impeding, and then I'm actively participating in ensuring that other people are experiencing as much public joy as possible. And then that goes back to like reciprocity, things like just yielding on the sidewalk, assisting someone in a public space, making eye contact, acknowledging someone's presence. Things like that. That's where you get to the research that's linked to reciprocity and also embodiment, right? And then there is, of course, policy and design. So people can't co-steward physical infrastructure without permission from the municipality or the private partner of a semi-public, private public space, right? So it's then looking at it through the policy lens and at the policy level. So co-stewardship actually goes from individual to social to structural to hard design. So absolutely, hard infrastructure.
In doing this work, especially with young people who are in so much instability and transition, generally just because of all of the things that come with being a young person, were you surprised by how you saw joy expressed or defined in them?
I think that there are patterns and there are also distinctions. And so when I led my project with Eva's, which is a shelter, and they also do some transitional housing for the young people there, I had the great opportunity of working with them. They have an incredible new executive director. I just have to shout her out, Aisha Francis, and she's just so brilliant. And I had the real gift of working with her, and she came to every session, was on the ground, and these young people also participated, and they're navigating some big, tough issues. These young folks are navigating precarious housing and all of the complex backstories that come with that. And so we had several sessions. We did a botanical garden session with a landscape architect. We went to the art gallery with a planning professor who's also an artist. And we also did a DJing workshop that my daughter popped into, along with her colleague and good friend, Nino. And so we had these three different experiences. And what I found was, I won't say that I was surprised, because one of the things that I practice doing is overestimating people who are defined as historically marginalized. So I always overestimate. I set the benchmark very high because I know that people who are navigating the margins or who've come out of the margins, they have a level of magic and resilience that a lot of people don't see or really recognize. And so when I think about all of these different outings, I think some really beautiful moments for me. Let's see, there were so many. So one of the things that I noted was that um, in these shared experiences of joy, people need, especially young people navigating the types of things that I've just talked about, need different pathways to participate. And they need different duration of time to warm up. Definitely, there are barriers like feeling surveilled or feeling like they don't belong in the space. So before every single session, we had a circle and we all talked about what we needed to facilitate our joy. How could we be stewards of each other's public joy? What kinds of supports were needed? I found that to be super helpful. I also think allowing people to not immediately feel joy or express joy in ways that might be expected. Some people express joy very quietly. I think when people hear the word joy, they think of this extroverted person who's being so exuberant, you know? Joy and extroversion are not synonymous. I'm sure you know that, Chip, but I think that's a lot of the perception sometimes. But I want to share this one moment. When we went to the botanical garden, we asked the young people to find a partner and go off and find a part of the garden that brought them a sense of joy immediately when they walked in. Like, what sparked joy for you when you walked into this botanical garden? Because we wanted to hear from them before the landscape architect started guiding them through the process. We start with always the voice of the participants. And so we lost two of the young men during that activity. And so, people went and we went to everyone's spot and people shared what brought them joy. And then we completely lost two of the young men. And someone joked that they probably went off and were smoking weed somewhere. Like young people, didn't want to be a part of the group. So about halfway into this tour through the botanical garden, we find these two young men who had found this little ravine and they were crossing it. They found a way to support each other in crossing the ravine. And so they got lost and so caught up in the ravine and so caught up in that little oasis of public joy that they became disconnected from us. So it wasn't that they weren't participating in the activity. It's that they were so deeply caught up in the activity that they had lost track of us. And so they shared their experience of public joy with the ravine, and then everybody crossed the ravine and had their embodied experience. But what was so beautiful about this experience was that a couple of these young people who, again, are facing so much crises, actually stepped in the water and got their shoes and ankles and socks wet and helped other young people step on the rocks who were more hesitant or afraid to cross. And then another young person grabbed everyone's cell phones so that they could have a personal video or photograph of them taking this journey across the ravine. The way in which they intuitively and immediately co-stewarded each other's joy and supported each other in those 20 minutes was enough for me to say, this is why I'm fucking doing this. This is what co-stewardship of public joy looks like. This is what it is.
So what I was going to ask, and I think that story really illustrated, is looking at through the arc of this work for these young people, both, it seems like I could easily imagine the impact individually on the participants who were engaged in this work. And I wanted to ask you about the impact of the collective and in the community and how the community was strengthened through this work. But I think that story beautifully illustrates how they all came and stewarded each other's crossing the ravine and doing that. So it's just a really powerful and beautiful anecdote of the benefit of the work. So that's fantastic.
It was truly a special moment. It's the kind of thing that you absolutely cannot plan for. We didn't document it intentionally. We just wanted the space to exist for them. But yeah, there's nothing like watching a couple young people actually step into the stream of water.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful visual and metaphor in a lot of ways. So thank you so much for sharing that. You're working on or you've been working on, you're about to release Black Public Joy. This book, I assume, builds on years of work and reflection. What was the seed for this?
I think that there are a couple of seeds, so I'm going to try to say them as fast as possible. So one seed was an early memory that I had of myself as a kid in a 1970s style shopping mall. Music came on the loudspeaker, and I started to sway my body, like started to kind of dance. And my mother very quickly discouraged me from doing so because she felt as though, you're a little girl, you're poor, and you're Black. It's too stereotypical. Little Black kid dancing in the mall. She was like, absolutely not. So there was that memory. And then another seed for this was during George Floyd, which seems very counterintuitive. But all of the advocacy and the conversations about the histories of spatialized and spatial injustice and all of the harm that was done, during that time. This is actually when I got the book deal. During that time, there was so much. I didn't watch the video. I didn't think I would do well if I did, and so I didn't. And I did a lot of advocacy work, and as I guess a bit of personal respite for myself, in between doing the advocacy work, I started having my graphic designer design these beautiful graphic designs of my Black urbanist colleagues, and I would post them on Instagram and sort of just uplift them because it was such a scary and a sad time for like all of us. And my editor at the time, because I already had a first book deal, gave me a call and said, that's a really different thing you're doing in this moment. It's so beautiful. And that's not what this moment's actually giving. It's not giving a lot of beauty, right? And as I talked about it more, I made a commitment then to leave this moment with some joy and that's how it started to come together. And I thought, we talk a lot, especially those of us who do any kind of work around spatial injustice and, design equity, anything like that. We have to be versed on the histories of harm. We have to be versed on all of the gaps and the bad public space policies. Sometimes that creates a gap in the narrative. It becomes a one-note narrative, and I really wanted to fill that gap. And as I thought about Black literature, so much Black literature is focused on harm and histories of harm, particularly place-based harm and systemic harm. And I think that work is critically important. A part of my audacity, my confidence, my love and sense of self comes from having exposure to that literature. But I started thinking, what else? There's a narrative thread missing here. And so in the introduction of my book, I talk about this idea of I acknowledge the value of that literature, but then I also say, why not bend the narrative arc toward public joy? It was when I wrote those words, I don't think I knew exactly what I meant fully. And I don't think I knew how much I would have to struggle with myself to not feel like I was betraying a grand narrative about who we are as Black people, especially as someone who's descended from the transatlantic slave trade. That is something that I would never want to minimize or gloss over. And so I had some real personal intellectual battles with that. But by the time I came out on the other side of this book, I'm so proud of the work, and I'm so proud of myself for having the courage to do the work. In a world that is so polarized and pessimistic, in a world where you can actually become, vilified for being, having toxic positivity or for, shining a light on something that's beautiful. Pushing through with this work, I'm so proud that I did. And I actually, gathered stories from my practice, of course, and I interviewed people who are creating spaces of Black public joy and rituals of Black public joy all across North America. And they were so delighted to share their stories and that part of their practice because there is not a lot of space to be Black and joyful in public. And there's almost a social contract between whether it's publishers or people who greenlight movies or even municipalities in the placemaking space. There's almost some sort of social agreement that we are allowed to be included as long as we are marginalized and miserable. And this book breaks that contract unapologetically.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And like you mentioned, kind of the coming from the place of deficit language in public space. And it seems to me like as you're moving into a new realm, almost even insisting that public joy and Black public joy it's a necessity in the same way that as a municipality needs to provide water and safety. And, it's part of the civic obligation that we have. There's been a lot of trauma and valid that we need to not lose memory of any of that. And we can also exist in this space of joy.
I do say in the book that Black public joy is as urgent as justice. And I mean that. And I also in the book talk about the fact that regardless of our identities, race, class, gender, that the call is for all of us to become better stewards of each other's public joy.
Can I ask about that when you say the joy is for all of us? When I think about who needs to be part of this work in terms of practitioners, disciplines, is this work for planners, artists, social workers, everybody, all of the above? Who are the people you want to get the book and understand it?
It's really very much, I know whenever a writer writes a book, they always say it's for everybody.
Right.
I think the salesperson tells them to say that, but
Right.
truly, this book is for all of us. And one of the things is when you think about Black public joy, it's quite universal. Like a lot of our dialect, our practices, our style and fashion, it really, in a large way, shapes mainstream culture and what we see every single day in the public square. And so a lot of people are participating in Black public joy anyways. And sometimes it's in very superficial ways. In the book, I talk about the fact that it's not just about a cool trend. Black public joy is actually a phenomenon that the auction block could not extinguish. That's how powerful it is. And I actually do, again, the research so that people can understand where the DAP comes from, where certain phrases come from, where certain types of dance comes from, where a lot of things we'll see in 2S LGBT plus culture comes from. Like, I really trace those threads all the way back. And I also connect them to other people's cultures and expressions of joy as well. It's an invitation to take Black people's rituals, histories, and cultures and spaces of joy seriously, because it should be taken seriously. It's a phenomenon, and so many people are participating in that phenomenon without giving it as much respect as it deserves. And then the other invitation is for people to think about their own public joy and public joy practices that come from their cultures. So it really is, again, a thing that I say in my practice is that there is always enough space, joy, and justice for all of us. And so I really hope that as people read the book, that they learn about this particular narrative, feel invited to reflect on their own traditions of public joy, and feel that spaciousness and sense of being emboldened. And that responsibility, that call to being co-stewards of each other's public joy. So this book is indeed for everyone. And public space, what is public space if not a space for each of us to explore, exchange, and create new expressions of public joy together? That's what public space is.
I love it. What brings you joy right now in your work?
I think reclaiming my work and situating it unapologetically within this context of not only Black public joy, but public joy more broadly, refusing to continue to be the person who shows up to solve a problem strictly. I'm so grateful, like that work built a 10-year practice. I am so grateful for those opportunities and those learnings, but also as a 50-something-year-old woman, I feel so joyful to be really the author of what the next chapter of my practice is going to look like. And I am no longer going to be going to cities to solve their problems. If they don't have a bigger vision around possibility and public joy, then they need to get someone else to do the work.
Jay, thank you so much. The only word that I can think of to express this conversation has just been, it's been a joy. And so I really appreciate you. I'm so excited to read the new book and just to continue following the amazing work you're doing in place and community and enjoy public joy. So I can't thank you enough for this conversation. It's really been a treat.
Thank you. As for me as well. Thank you, Chip.
Jay Pitter is an award-winning placemaker and author who creates joyful public spaces that foster belonging, prosperity, and cultural memory. She advances this work through cultural planning, policy frameworks, and storytelling, bridging rigor and collective imagination to advance public joy as essential urban infrastructure and a human right. There's so much more to learn about how Jay is advancing public joy, and you can start at jpitter.com. As always, links from the show are in the episode notes or at sidewalkballet.com. Listening to Jay, I'm reminded that public joy isn't something we wait for. It's something we practice. It's built through the choices we make in our neighborhoods, our institutions, our public spaces, and the way we show up for one another. Joy isn't a break from the serious work of cities. It's part of how we get that work done. Sidewalk Ballet is presented by Big Creative Consulting, strengthening communities through culture and place. Learn more at bigcreativeconsulting.com. Also by This Must Be the Place, a bi-monthly newsletter connecting placemaking professionals to opportunities. Learn more at thismustbe.org. Contributors include Abra Allen and myself. Engineering and editing by Ryan Musante. Our theme music was composed by the Peacoat Project. If this conversation resonated, please share it with someone who's doing the work of keeping their community whole, and join the conversation on our Discord server, also linked at sidewalkballet.com. I'm Chip. Thank you for joining us on this block of the Sidewalk Ballet. I'll see you downtown.